Savarkar was an atheist who had either inspired or committed various acts of individual terrorism, that is, assassinating British officials or inspiring others to do so, and he'd been put in jail as a result. And while he was in jail, he invented a new philosophy, calling it Hindutva. And he wrote in a pamphlet, Hindutva, What is a Hindu? He wrote, a Hindu is a person who regards the land of Bharatvarsh, the land of India, from the Indus to the seas as his fatherland as well as his holy land, and that is a cradle land of his religion. So Pitra Bhumi was fatherland and Punya Bhumi was holy land. Muslims and Christians might be born of Indian blood, and they could therefore convert back to being Hindus, but they could never really belong as Muslims and Christians because their holy lands were outside in Arabia and Palestine. Later, the image of Mother India, one that was embedded in the national consciousness, was also added, and Hindutva pulled off the quite complicated balancing act of creating a masculinized image of the nation's strong, aggressive, and recovered pride, along with a feminized image of being under assault. As he wrote, at last she was rudely awakened on the day when Muhammad of Ghazni cursed the industry and the frontier line of Sindhustan and invaded her. That day the conflict of life and death began. That day, and then he said, nothing makes the self conscious of itself so much as a conflict with the non-self. Nothing can weld peoples into a nation and nations into a state as the pressure of a common foe. Hatred separates as well as unites. Much, much later, in 2002, a feminist human rights investigation into the Gujarat massacre reported that students were asked to celebrate Independence Day as the day their mother was ripped asunder. Violent imagery of what had been done to Hindus, as well as a promotion of how they should treat others, frequently videoed, first on videos and then circulated, rape of women and so on, or on cameras is quite common. But internally, Hindutva could afford to be quite Catholic. Sikhs, Jains, atheists, reformers, and traditionalists could all belong. The pamphlet, Khaki Shorts and Saffron Flags, written by some of the hated Marxist historians, says, Savarkar soars above sectarian and ritual differences within what he has defined as the fold of Hindutva. It was intended to be a unifying movement, and much later they interviewed in the 1990s Sudarshan, Assistant General Secretary of the RSS, who described this Catholicity as many flowers, one garland, many rivers, one ocean. But he warned the country can only have one Hindu culture, so all must accept it. And all must accept Ram, if not as divine, at least as the nation's hero. And this, of course, was a break from the purifying tradition of the Arya Samaj, with its supposed return to the Vedic text, which actually stripped out a lot of traditional Hindu practices of worship in temples and with idols and so on. So Hindutva manages to refer to the purifying movements that had stripped away many Hindu practices and yet mobilized brilliantly around movements such as the building of the Ram temple, where a lot of Hindus could understand this as a devotional practice, who were bhakts of Ram, that is, devotees of Ram. And therefore, even though it was framed as in a very new way, it was something that they could relate to. And Ram as an aggressive masculine figure, as the perfect ruler. Another ideologue called Golwalkar, a man whom the Prime Minister reveres, had written very favorably. Remember, this is the 1920s and 30s, and the RSS was formed in the 20s, and they were very conscious of movements across the world. So he'd written about, he was looking across to Germany, and he said, to keep up the purity of the race and its culture, Germany shocked the world by purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. Race pride at its highest has been manifested here, a good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by. And then he also said, our nation means, and independent of the question of majority, always must mean the Hindu nation and naught else. Modi is a devotee of Golwalkar and defended him in a long laudatory essay, saying that he had been unfairly targeted as pro-Mussolini and Hitler. And others have also tried to dismiss it and said this is just a couple of paragraph, statement here and there, and you can't put too much emphasis on it. But an Italian historian has established that they didn't just admire from afar. Correspondents of Hindu-supporting newspapers based in London reported approvingly of Mussolini's revival of Italian fortunes and were particularly impressed by the youth movements that he founded. And one of the mentors of the RSS journeyed to Italy, which made a deep impression on him. Mussolini had turned an easygoing, non-martial Italians into a martial race. And the historian says he didn't realize how skin deep that was, but at the time, it was particularly the youth bodyguards, the youth militias and guards of the revolution that he was very keen on. And the Marathi paper Kesari reported developments in Italy from London and quite possibly had access to English language materials on fascism, such as a 1927 pamphlet titled The Recent Laws for the Defense of the State, which laid out measures such as a ban on subversive parties, limitations to the press, expulsion of disaffected persons from public posts, and finally the death sentence. And there was also a meeting with Mussolini where he pledged to continue Mussolini's methods when he returned to India. This is a man called Munje. He said, I have thought out a scheme when he came back to India, he told a newspaper, which provides for Hindu Dharm Rashtra, that is the Hindu religion, a state of the Hindu religion, standardized Hinduism. But this scheme cannot be brought about unless we have our own Swaraj, our own freedom, like Shivaji of old, Shivaji being a great hero, actually across the political spectrum, who had fought the Mughals and established his own state, or a dictator like Hitler or Mussolini. This does not mean we should sit with folded hands until the dictator arises. We should formulate a scientific scheme and carry on the propaganda for it. And they were in touch with the English, the Italian consuls and so on. At the same time, Congress leaders were also traveling to Italy and Germany, and there was one faction of the Congress that actually became much more closely involved with the Axis powers than the Hindutva group did, and formed the Indian National Army, which fought against the British out of soldiers that were prisoners of war. But other factions of the Congress were very conscious. The leader, Nehru, was very, very conscious of fascism. He visited Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War to support the Republican side. There were British socialists writing for the Congress papers. They were very, very internationally aware. And I know that when my own grandparents, Nehru's sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit and her husband Ranjit Pandit, who had studied in Germany and would have made an excellent ambassador to the British on the principle of my enemy's enemy is my friend, they avoided meeting Mussolini because they didn't want to be used for fascist propaganda. But before the war, Savarkar continued to support the Sudeten Germans' desire for unity with Germany. And after the war started, the organization, one of his organizations, the Hindu Mahasabha, continued to support German expansionism, but muted its support and negotiated instead with the British Viceroy Linlithgow for responsive cooperation. So at the war, you have at the start of the Second World War, you have the Congress saying, we want independence and we will be with you. We are with you in the fight against fascism, but we will not be made to go to war as a subject country. And they started the Quit India movement and left the provincial governments they were in and went to jail. Savarkar, who was actually supportive of Nazism and with other members of his party, stayed in what they call responsive cooperation. So it managed to maintain its fascist and increasingly its Nazi sympathies while simultaneously declaring loyalty to the empire and trying to negotiate some gains, such as more Indians in the military and running a militia and so on. In contrast, the Congress had responded to Kristallnacht with a resolution against the Nazis and for protection and asylum for Jews. So you have this extremely difficult time, and you have at that time, shortly when the war ends, you have Britain leaving, making preparations to leave, and partition coming up, which was in fact a very difficult time for all Indians, I think, at that time, because partition was opposed, and in fact most strongly opposed by Gandhi, more than other leaders of the Congress who eventually accepted it. And there were mass killings that went on both sides, across the border. Trainloads of people were killed coming one way or the other. But at that time, there was, of course, a lot of rage because this fatherland and Holy Land had been divided. And I'm not sure what the Hindutva activists wanted to do about Muslims, because they didn't think that they could be part of the Indian state as they envisaged it, but on the other hand, they didn't want a separate state. And one of the people who was particularly angry was a man called Nathuram Godse. Now, in the 80s, when I was when Bandung File, this Black Current Affairs program, started, we did what I mentioned before, a program about this movement that was on at the time, but which we didn't know what it would become. And it was quite a prescient program. And it interviewed Gopal Godse, who was Nathuram, that's him on the left, his brother, who Nathuram Godse was hanged for the assassination of Gandhi. His brother was put on trial and served time in prison, but was later released. And he was interviewed later, and he was completely unrepentant. And he said, we had to kill Gandhi. There were 10, and we thought, what will we lose? We may lose 10 people, but it had to be done because he was a traitor. And it also interviewed was Romila Thapar, who was a historian, and talked about this movement for Ram Janmabhoomi. And one of the things about the Hindutva movement is that although it draws heavily on the epics, there isn't a willingness to see the epics simply a story. Because in a world where you have to be both scientific and rational, as well as have a transcendental vision, there has to be a substance to the epic, and therefore it has to be grounded in a particular place, at a particular time, a particular location. In fact, to create a sort of Mecca, which is very unlike traditional Hinduism, where the central place was supposed to be the birthplace of Ram, so a mosque that had been built on top of it was to be brought down, and this temple building exercise in which Hindus all over the world were sending bricks to it and had mobilized around it, that would happen. So that's what the program was about. But it was also about what was happening here in Britain, because the RSS and the VHP, the RSS being called the HSS, had been funded by local councils as cultural organizations. And there was actually an Asian, a Hindu councillor who said, these people are fascist organizations, we do not understand why the GLC and others were funding them. And just to jump ahead in my story, Ken Livingstone was interviewed, and he said, oh, we didn't know they were fascists, we knew nothing about it, because what do we know, we just do what's recommended, and we wouldn't do it. But as we know from Ken Livingstone's story, that kind of funding, there's been much more emphasis on Muslim groups, extremist Muslim groups being funded, which indeed there are and continue to be. But there is this tradition of putting money into some of these groups as well. So at that time in the 80s, we in Britain were trying to grapple both with the movement that was happening in India and this revival of the idea of God's sake. But when the BJP came to power this time around, Godse was announced as a major hero. And people wanted to, and you can see he's very respectfully treated there with the gardens and so on. And he was supposed to be put, people wanted to build a statue to him and so on. And they saw him as having dealt with the traitor Gandhi. And on the right you can see a portrait of Savarkar with senior BJP leaders very respectfully bowing before it. And that portrait was put up of Savarkar in the previous BJP administration, which sort of hangs in the Hall of Heroes opposite Gandhi. Now Savarkar, who had founded the RSS, the idea of Hindutva and was involved with the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, he had also been charged with in the plot to assassinate Gandhi, and he stood trial for that, but was eventually acquitted. And it's extremely painful reading accounts of that, because there was one informer who turned state's evidence, but there was felt to be no corroborating evidence. But years later, there was a commission of inquiry. It had happened years later and then been suppressed, and then it was made public. And it's painful reading because there was further evidence from other people who were never called as witnesses. And in fact, it's still somewhat a mystery to me as to why there wasn't an attempt to go all out and implicate Savarkar as well. Because he certainly expected, because he said that he would keep away, and he'd done this before under the British, that he wouldn't be involved with politics, that he would live quietly, and so on. He'd made these deals many times before when he'd been arrested on other occasions. And it's quite likely that he expected to be convicted this time around, but he wasn't. And he lived to many years later. And today, in many shakas, it's the groups, the RSS groups that are active here. There are students are taught, young men who come to these things, teach the children about this killing. And so that we have transcripts of a teacher talking to the children about the killing of Gandhi and playing Mark Tully, a famous BBC reporter, saying a Hindu fanatic killed Gandhi. And the children are taught that they mustn't say Hindu fanatic. This is wrong because it implicates all Hindus. You know, there's a sense that there's a sense of persecution that Hindus are being implicated in the killing of Gandhi. And he lists, the teacher lists numerous assassins, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, etc., and says they were not deemed to be by Christian fanatics. And he says if someone comes to the RSS, doesn't mean the RSS preaches to kill somebody. I tell this to lots of journalists. And he says 3 commissions have all been put out by the government of India to find out if the RSS was involved. All have exonerated the RSS. And do we preach in RSS and HSS to kill for somebody's views? The class in unison says, no, we don't. And so he says that must be our argument. When anybody says RSS killed and you find anyone blaming for Gandhi's assassination, you must put your protest. But at the same time, then the boys ask, well, then who did kill Gandhi and why? And he says, well, Gandhi, betrayed India, and that's why, of course, he's our leader, and we don't say anything. But, so there's a strong doublethink going on. There's a sense that we're being persecuted if it's being named that the RSS wasn't involved. That's not true because the RSS was banned for a year. They were found to be involved. They were banned, and so on. And he also, in the course of these discussions, was asked whether the RSS and HSS had helped in Modi's elections, and the teacher answers, they did. Every Swayamsevak, that's every volunteer, had to go into town, make sure they speak to people to make sure that they do help Modi in the election. This was done secretly. But when this evidence, and there have been several attempts over the years to put evidence before the Charity Commission. There were attempts after 2002, the Gujarat massacre, which showed that apparently independent charities were actually, one called Seva was actually sharing charity numbers with Hindutva organizations, and that was involved with charitable work in a way that was actually promoting Hindutva messages and excluding people that they didn't like and so on. So there was a complaint made at that time. At that time, the Charity Commission said they couldn't, we couldn't demonstrate that, the shopkeeper collecting money in his collecting box, that money actually went for buying, the swords and the daggers that actually killed people. We couldn't prove that indivisible link from the collecting box in Britain to the killings in India, and therefore nothing could be done. In other words, if you couldn't prove things to the level of criminal responsibility, the Charity Commission wouldn't act. And then in this case, when years later you have this discussion filmed about how, whether the RSS and HSS are one thing, which is really not very controversial. I mean, Wikipedia says so, and they will say that themselves, as they told the children. On that instance, he was actually telling the truth, along a lot of other half-truths and direct lies. But the Charity Commission said there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate, this is in 2015, so not that long ago, to demonstrate that the views expressed by the speaker were endemic or systematic in the charity and its activities. The charity found no other evidence of formal links between the charity and RSS. The Commission considered the implications for the charity if it was associated with RSS, included whether the trustees were in fact furthering the charitable purposes and could be acting in the charity's interest, etc., etc. And it said the trustees assured the Charity Commission that there were no formal links between the two organizations, that there was only an ideological commonality, and this then was not considered further during the inquiry. So even when you have a direct admission of links, they just have to say no, we're not linked, and there you go. It's put aside. And this, by the way, happens with the Muslim groups as well. So I don't want anybody to get away with the idea that because a lot of the discourse around this is one set of people pointing fingers at the other set of people. But what we find is, only very recently, Khatme Nabuwat, a very violent organization promoting blasphemy laws in Pakistan and in other countries, and attacking Ahmadiyyas and other people they consider apostates, has been welcomed by the mayor, by the police, stood on platforms with senior people here in Manchester. So it's something that is happening with Muslim groups as well as with Hindu groups, where whether it's Labour or whether it's the Conservatives, the management of minorities is seen as being done through communal and fundamentalist organizations. And this is so insane, but it continues. And although most of the public discourse is around Labour and its links with extremism, we've been hearing during the anti-Semitism debate, and those links are certainly there, but they're not the only ones. Because although you won't find Tory ministers necessarily hanging out with senior Muslim Brotherhood people, they have issued statements which quietly welcome Muslim Brotherhood leaders to Britain as refugees after they were overthrown in Egypt. This is at a time when they're actually stopping people fleeing regimes like that from coming to this country, stopping Christian archbishops from coming to this country lest they claim asylum from Syria and Iraq. And the Home Office has quietly supported the Muslim Brotherhood, also supported charitable funding. It gave money to an umbrella charity, which was actually Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami, which is an Indian organization, in fact, an Indian organization of political Islam that was founded in India about 20 years after the Hindutva movement was founded. So this is a problem that we face if we're challenging fundamentalism, is that the local states, as well as the national government, is absolutely embedded with these groups. And one of the examples of that for the Tories is Priti Patel, who is right-wing Brexiteer, seen as an up-and-coming young minister until she went off message and made trips to Israel in her own time, but made sort of government-to-government contacts and had strong right-wing links with the Israeli right-wing groups, and as well as having very strong links with Hindutva groups, and she, of course, was in the cabinet. One of the confusing things, or that some people might find confusing, is that although the BJP and the RSS and the VHP have a profoundly conservative view of women's role in society, they've also had a lot of women leaders and very aggressive women leaders, and now in the cabinet there are many women. But although the government didn't oppose the recent Supreme Court judgment that decriminalized homosexuality, they stayed away. But you find now in the days afterwards, there are waves and waves of condemnation coming from the Hindu right. I don't know if the Christians have spoken, but they were some of the main groups that actually took the case to court earlier to get, when it was earlier decriminalized, to have it reversed. And the Muslim groups have come out and condemned the thing. So they're all, the religious leaders are all at one, even though the government has, for the moment, backed off as the government. And one of the things that became a central plank of the BJP's political strategy was to demand a uniform civil code, that is, a uniform common law, which is something that you think that all secularists should support. And in fact, many do, but when the BJP demanded it, it became something that was very difficult to negotiate with women's groups about. Why? Because their version of law may have been a Hindu majoritarian law, because they tended to have a discourse about Muslims having special laws and special rights. But of course, it's not just Muslims who have Muslim law, personal law. Everybody's governed by religious law in India. So Hindus are governed by various forms of Hindu law, Muslims by Muslim law, Christians, and so on, by other laws. And so there emerged a huge debate in India about what to do and how to position oneself in this. And whereas a very few feminists still argued for some form of uniform code, in conditions where it was impossible to negotiate what they called they preferred to call it a gender-just code rather than a uniformity, not to stress uniformity, but to stress justice. And it was found very difficult to negotiate. And so most of the strategies have been about reforming the personal laws individually, so that property rights have been granted to Hindu women through various law reforms. Divorce came in the early period after independence. The great Dalit leader, Ambedkar, who had formed, who was a great constitutional lawyer and sat in the Constituent Assembly, had argued very strongly for a uniform code and said, why do we have our independence if we can't challenge religion and challenge caste and challenge these caste distinctions? And those arguments had been in the end, what happened was it was put in a sort of as a general principle in the directive principles of the Constitution, but it wasn't instituted at the time. So there's a little bit of a double think about it.